Hi, good morning. My name is Sarai Cook, and I am a formerly incarcerated woman. I founded the National Trauma Awareness Initiative. We seek to bring awareness to the trauma that's in the criminal justice system and how many people that are within the criminal justice system have experienced a lot of trauma and how that a lot of times has led to their incarceration. And today I have Devon Adams with me, and we're going to talk about restorative justice um, and a little bit about the connection between trauma and restorative justice. So Devon, will you please introduce yourself and tell me what you're working on?
All right, cool. Well, first off, thanks for having me come and be a part of this. It's an honor to help you in your work and the movement that you're pushing around trauma, especially with people who are formerly incarcerated. Myself, I'm also formerly incarcerated from Seattle. Served about 22 years and recently released. And I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to work for a restorative justice agency called Collective Justice, where I'm now the fundraising coordinator, but also a facilitator of our HEAL circles, which is an acronym for Healing Education for Accountability and Liberation. So right now it's, juggling in between fundraising and holding space. And one of the circles that I work with is young folks out of Seattle, in the ages of 18 to 25, working with them to process trauma and harm.
How old were you when you were incarcerated?
I was 20 at the time, but that wasn't my first time, being involved with the criminal legal system. My first interaction with law enforcement was probably like 11, 12.
So just to get us started, um, I want to talk a little bit about my experience. I, long before I was incarcerated, which my first time being incarcerated was 1991.
Mm.
I was about 13 years old. But long before that, I was a victim of crimes. Um, I was abused and yeah, I was a victim of crimes. But one thing that kind of comes to mind, and when I think of restorative justice, is I was shot twice in a drive-by when I was 15. Um, and in processing kind of that situation, I never really processed the situation. It definitely didn't deter me from the life that I was leading at that time. And but in thinking about restorative justice and what that is, and sort of doing a research for this interview, um, I started to think about the person that shot me, and it was a car full of people that were involved, and I really, honestly, it came to me that those people are my brothers and sisters,
Right, right,
and like even the person like I that pulled the trigger um, is my brother because I know what got him to that point.
right, right. Um, you mind if I make a comment?
Uh, yeah, I'm happy.
So one of the things that I've learned in this space doing work at Collective Justice, around a lot of brilliant folks is that, our first experience with trauma is not causing it, right? Our first experience with trauma is experiencing it as someone who has been harmed. And so when we think about how this plays out in the long run, when a person is experiencing trauma and is being harmed, um, and having agency taken away from them, having their dignity taken away from them, having their humanity taken away from them, we tend to show up in ways that we normally wouldn't. And so when you reference this, experience of being shot and then having the reflection time to reflect and say, I know that this person who did this to me, um, you know, this is a brother who has gone through their own experience. It's a real reality. Like this person didn't just wake up one day and start, firing a gun and shooting at people. There's a series of events that led up to that happening. And I think in this society today, we're conditioned to look at things in such an individualized manner where, yes, a person should be accountable for harm that they cause. And at the same time, we have to be mindful that there's actually conditions that are created before a person even realizes it, that allow for that to happen. Right. And so for in the experience that you had in the neighborhoods that you came up in, the conditions which were created by systems outside of your control, created an environment where violence was a norm because people weren't having their needs met, and they were living in trauma and showing up and reacting to that trauma in the only way that they knew how. And I think that that's what's going on in a lot of communities of color, is when you're deprived of having access to the things that you need in order to be resourced, then we show up in ways that we normally wouldn't.
So I want to explain, there's the definition of trauma that's out there.
Yeah.
And I look at that definition, I understand that definition, but my definition is different, a little bit different.
Entitled to that. For sure.
Yeah. So, what it was for me is being in situations where I didn't have a choice, and I felt like I didn't have a choice.
Absolutely.
I feared for my life. I feared for, it was just a trigger of like shame when I shouldn't even have known what shame was, that feeling, and that feeling of like worthlessness, and and just afraid, and like the feeling in my body of like just like all these chemicals in my body that's like overwhelmed me. And it was just seeing things and being a part of things that I didn't understand, and that I just felt like I couldn't get away from.
Yeah, for sure.
And and that, so that's what it is to me. And I feel like, honestly, like I lived in that for so long. It's talk when you think about like post-traumatic stress disorder, and like people that have post-traumatic stress disorder. And then, but I lived in that from as far as I can remember, as young as I can remember, till maybe like 4 years old. And then again from like some off and on from like 4 to like 12, and then like constantly from 12 to 28, and then off and on from 28 to now. Yeah. So when I think about, trauma, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'll ask you, what do you think was the longest period of, and then I'm also want to put in there the fight, flight, freeze, fawn feelings. How long, if you can think back, what's the longest period of time that you had lived in that state?
I would say a very similar experience to yours. As a child, like my first memories are of violence inside the home with my father. He was a pretty violent individual. And then as soon as I stepped out of the house and was in other spaces, violence was prevalent. So even in school, violence was used. And once I got into my teens, violence was constant. I started getting incarcerated at around 12 or 13. So going inside the institutions, those were violent and traumatic. And then, even when I would be released from those institutions, being still involved in the lifestyle, constant violence and trauma, and then to go to prison and serve 22 years, that's trauma and violence, you're swimming in it. So for 22 years straight, and then to get out And I think while I'm not directly like experiencing the same amount of trauma that I did, prior to my incarceration, I think vicariously we experience it by being in proximity to people who are directly impacted. Because a lot of the times, I know you've mentioned triggering, right? And so working with folks while you're trying to do this, working with folks while you're trying to manage your own challenging issues, uh, and then experiencing something while you're working with them can trigger events that have happened in your life. And so it's, your subconscious doesn't know the difference when you're talking about something or you're experiencing something like consciously, you might be very aware that this thing isn't happening again, but in the back of your mind, it's playing itself out. And like you mentioned shame and all these other feelings that come up with that, like I definitely can relate. I think it's something that has been constant, and that's why I'm in this work, is to do my own processing, do my own healing, and at the same time try to introduce other folks to what RJ has to offer as a form of healing.
Can you tell me a little bit more about like restorative justice, from your perspective as an impacted person, and then also like how you got involved with restorative justice?
Yeah, for sure. So RJ, we call it RJ Restorative Justice. For me, it was being incarcerated, being in prison, and having a deep desire at some point along in my own growth of wanting to make some type of amends for the harm that I caused. Now, like, just you hear restorative justice in like general terms and see, I might have saw something on TV of people coming together and having a conversation and trying to reconcile for a harm that was caused. And to me, that was something in the back of my mind I wanted to be a part of. And I was also a part of a couple of organizations inside the Black Prisoners Caucus and the Concerned Lifers organization. And I wasn't alone in wanting to engage community, engage people that I had harmed as a way of reconciling, like a lot of us did. And we were fortunate enough to meet up with the founder of the organization I work for now, Martina Cartman, and Dr. Catherine Beckett. And they just worked with us and introduced, through that came Heal, the program I was telling you about earlier. And I was able to really learn about what restorative justice was. And so like restorative justice to me is a process, it's a practice that it can take place inside of the system, or it can take place outside of the system. And it's a process it's a way of processing harm between the person who caused harm and the person who experienced harm, but really centering the folks who have been harmed, and how do you meet their needs, understanding that when you harm someone, there's an obligation to address those needs. And then also understanding that, like I mentioned earlier, that there's a responsibility of community to create conditions so that healing is possible and that change is possible. And so when I was first introduced to that, I was able to put like all these feelings of wanting to make things right. This to me created a process for that to happen. And initially, my hope was that at some point in time, I could have a direct dialogue with the person that I had harmed. Unfortunately, they don't share that same sentiment. And so then I was like, well, damn, how do you move forward? And so like RJ is also something that it doesn't require the other party in order to move through. And it's really just about understanding trauma, separating, the thing that you have that has happened to you, or the thing that you have done, and from who you are as an individual, and like taking agency over who you are, and like how I would say, like redefining yourself and creating your own definition of who you are, and living by values that you determine you want to practice. And so for me, RJ is just like a new way of life, right? It's a set of principles, a set of practices that allow me to practice self-accountability, to engage in accountable relationships, and try to create accountable communities where we don't rely on systems, right? We don't rely on systems that actually oppress us.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? That I don't understand it.
So as far as like the systems that oppress us,
I guess you said engage in a process,
yeah. Okay, so
and like, what does that look like?
yeah, so like for example, when you have folks who have experienced harm and someone who has caused harm, you know, in the system that that currently exists, what happens is the state steps in, right? And the state says you violated a law, right? And it takes the person who was harmed and the person who caused harm, it separates them. The state represents the person who was harmed, and an attorney represents the person who caused harm. And it's really adversarial, right? Initially, your job as the person who caused harm is to protect your liberty. You want to do whatever you can to protect your liberty. So there's no way of being accountable to the person that you harmed other than going to jail or being punished, right? And then on the other side is the person who has experienced harm, and the state isn't asking them, okay, you've experienced this harm. What are your needs? What can we do to help you? The state is telling that person, don't worry, we're going to get you justice. And justice is a punishment, right? And so we begin to think that the only way that you get to justice or you get to wholeness is by the person who caused harm going to prison and being punished. And then at the end of the day, what we all know to be true is that for you, and this is, ask yourself this, like, in all the instances where you have experienced harm, a person going to jail isn't what helped you move through that harm. And then on the other end of it, as someone who caused harm, getting put into a system and going to prison isn't what helped you move through and become more accountable. So we look at the way that the system currently exists is it's ineffective. It doesn't help the person who was harmed, and it doesn't help the person who caused harm. Now, RJ, we take a totally different look at it. Like I said, it's about centering the person who experienced harm. And what we find most of the time is that when a person has experienced trauma, there's a set of needs that they have that are unique to that person. And so it's really understanding what those needs are and the community coming and supporting that person and helping them address those needs. That might be a range of things, but it's an opportunity and it's a process to help that person understand, okay, I've experienced this harm. What are the things that I need to be able to move through and begin to heal? And then on the other end, there's an obligation. When a person is harmed, the person who caused that harm, there's an obligation for them to do to reconcile or make right what happened. And in some cases where someone has lost their life or sexual assault or domestic violence, there might be instances where that's not possible. But at the end of the day, what we do, we want to also help that person who caused that harm to help them understand why they did that, and then begin to create practices for themselves so that they don't have to be in a situation where they feel they need to harm other people. And then on the other end, for that person who might not want to engage, it's about how do we get you, in a space where you can begin to move through that trauma so that when you are triggered, you have the supports you need in order to continue to heal and move along on your life. And so that process could look a certain way. You could have, folks that are meeting with the person who experienced harm on a weekly basis, however long that looks. It's not a linear process. It's more of it moves at the pace of the relationship between the people who are involved in that process. And the hope is that at the end of the day, folks are able to skill up and share this work with one another so that when harms are caused, because they're not always the most serious, but when harms do take place, that we can rely on each other to address it instead of going back to a system that doesn't serve either party.
When I think about the harms that were caused to me, whatever happened in that instance.
Right.
But I look at the systems around it. So it's the foster care system, any systems that need to be implemented when parents are experiencing substance use disorder and are not able to care for their children, for a period of time.
Right.
Systems that are built around, that happens a lot, and how restoring me would have been me knowing that I was safe, like having the feeling of being safe, and that like knowing that whatever was happening was going to happen again, and knowing that like learning, I think, at that time, learning that learning more about like why I might have been feeling the way I was feeling, for all this long extended period of time, learning about that and not just being let out on my own, and then like having these behaviors that I had in school and then being ostracized for that. And like learning more about what happens when you are harmed, and like the feelings and sensations, and like mentally kind of learn. I think that for me would have been restorative.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I would ask you, so at any point in time, did folks like, did the system, did they really center you and try to figure out what your needs were?
No, never.
Never. And so again, they're essentially telling you what it is you need, right? Without even asking you. And without asking you, there's no way to figure out how to support you. And that doesn't mean that you have all the answers, but to be able to imagine what it would look like to be able to move through the things that you experienced would at least give you something to work towards, and then give you the support and the skills that you need to get there is far more effective than what you experienced, right? And then it's like you talk about being ostracized at school. That's another system again that it's either like you fall in line with what is going on, or we don't have time to figure out what your needs are. We're going to put you in special ed, and if special ed doesn't work out, we're going to kick you out of we're going to put you out of the classroom, right? So again, harm, that's more trauma.
Yeah, exactly. Like I remember an investigator talking to me. I was probably like 8 years old, and I remember going to like some therapy. Like all they did is they had this person talk to me, and then I went to therapy like a few times, and then when I was like 12, they put me on meds or whatever. Like there is no restorative justice.
Right.
But sorry, I'm emotional.
No, that's all right.
But then when I think about the harm that I caused, and what would have, what I needed to in that instance, I think about being incarcerated, and I think about the resources that I had due to the incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think about not having those resources prior to incarceration, and only having them, like having to go to prison to get the resources that I needed.
Right.
And like when I think about that, it kind of like makes me think about the harms that are caused by the 47,000 collateral consequences that are a result of a criminal record once you get out.
Right.
So prison wouldn't have been that bad if I didn't have all the collateral consequences after.
Right. Absolutely. And I think it's just this is a really clear example of it's really easy to try to, like, for yourself to have experienced all this trauma, and then when you go up in a courtroom, the court's saying like, I don't want to hear about what happened to you and what got you here, but I want to hold you accountable on an individual level and punish you for that, right? And I think that it puts like a spotlight on the fact that there's a lot of responsibility in the community to start questioning, how did we create an environment that harmed you so bad that you felt like this was the only way that you could show up, right? Yeah. And that's where a lot of it, like I said, when we cause harm, yes, there should be accountability. But at the end of the day, we have to start looking at the systems and the things that put these conditions in place for that to happen. Because the truth of the matter is, stuff like this doesn't happen in certain communities that look a certain way. right?
Yeah.
And why is that? Because they're fully resourced. They have the things they need and they're taken care of. They have great education systems. They have great social supports. But it's not like a coincidence that these are the things that are taking place in communities where you and I come from, right? Because we lack resources, we lack access to the things that we need. And then when we lack access to the things we need and we're dealing with trauma and we're showing up the best way we know how, and you end up in a situation where you're in front of a judge, they don't want to take that into account. And then the fact that again, you have to, on the other side of that, you go to prison, you do everything that you were supposed to do as far as serving your time, which to them is accountability. And then you come back in community and you're still punished for it, right? Is a reflection again of a system that isn't designed to support you or help you move through any of that and say, like, okay, you're really starting from a clean start. How do we support you and help you so that whatever happened before doesn't happen again? Right. And so I think what this really highlights is the fact that we can't keep relying on systems like what you're doing now by creating awareness around these issues and what folks are doing in all the different spaces for community work is beginning to collaborate and work collectively so that we can begin to create the communities that we want. Because we know that if we create the communities that we want with love and care, then we can begin to address those needs, resource one another, love on one another, and help each other heal and get through this stuff. And hopefully down the road, the young folks that come behind us won't have to rely on the systems because they'll have community to rely on.
What do you think is the biggest link between restorative justice, and being trauma informed?
So I think that's a really good question. Trauma informed is.
I'll just say being trauma informed to me is recognizing, going into a situation and recognizing that, looking at the person in front of you and just assuming like that they have been traumatized in some way, and then in that they might be in fight or flight mode, and kind of thinking about their feelings and emotions and how they might be feeling, trying to humanize the person, and kind of looking at the situation saying, okay, how could they be triggered, and how could their agency be taken away in the situation, and how can we give it back to them and make sure that they're in a state where they can actually utilize the prefrontal cortex.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's dope. So I would say that everything you said is totally in alignment with RJ work, right? So for instance, when I'll share my own experience, like when I went through HEAL, it was, learning about building as a community, this small group of people that we were working with, understanding that everybody in that space has experienced trauma. We all have triggers. And so it's really about how do we identify those things and get the skills to figure out how to process through them. It's like you said, you have fight or flight, all these survival strategies that we were taught unknowingly on how we had to respond to trauma and harm. And so I think what RJ does is it says, these are realities. And thank God you had these skills to get you through life in order to be here today, right? So everything that you did to get through life, when you were experiencing trauma, man, there's no judgment on that. That's what you had to do to get through and make it to the other side. And now that we're in a space where we can identify some other strategies, some other skills to help a person cope with triggers, to cope with that trauma, that's what we want to focus on. We want to practice, at the best way that we can on certain skills that will help us move through that trauma and move through those triggers. So I think, again, it's right in line with everything you're saying. Like, we're centering each other. Like, when folks are in those spaces, we're centering each other. We're trying to figure out what their needs are. And it's not just about people that are with you trying to identify your triggers. It's trying to help you identify them so that you know what to be aware of and how to move through those things. And knowing that you're loved and supported through that process.
So I feel like for me, and probably a lot of people, one of the biggest needs is just to feel safe, just to feel I'm safe. Whatever comes at me, I can handle it.
Right.
I'm gonna sit in this space and talk about really hard things. And, but just, I think even going through that process, for me, it would make the rest of the world a little safer.
For sure. For
Because then
sure.
I also am knowing more about like what's going on in other people's minds, because
Right.
that's what I always try to read everyone's minds and try to figure everything out, because so I feel safe. I'm like, okay, they do this and then this and this and this happens, or
Mm-hmm.
this and this and this, so they're probably going to move like that, and then I got to move like this.
Right. And
But
I
it's
think
all safety, like a feeling. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think a lot of the times we're led to believe that we're in this on our own, right? Like this process of healing is a unique experience to ourselves. It's an individual experience. And in reality, it's a it's it requires all of us. And I think as someone who's indigenous, like indigenous practices teach you this, like it's not about an individual, it's about a community. And so when you have more opportunities to engage with people that share a similar experience, you're able to build with them, you're able to understand, you're able to establish trust, and from there, accountable relationships where you can build a community where you do feel safe, right? And I
Yeah.
think that that's really essentially what our approach is. Like we want to be able to create spaces where people feel safe, where they have agency, where they have dignity, and they have belonging. Because for the work in the space that I'm in, like it was a dope way of putting it for me. It wasn't just like when we talked about trauma. Trauma is anything that disrupts your agency, your safety, dignity, or belonging, right?
Yeah.
Anything that takes those things away. And when we look at society as it currently exists, all from the minute the colonizers came, that's what they took from people, man. And
Yeah.
so when we think about now how we are trying to address trauma is we're trying to help folks understand you do have choice. You are in an environment where you're safe. You do have dignity. I see you. I see your trauma. I see what you've experienced. And through all of that, I see your humanity. And then your belonging. You have connection. We have connection and you have belonging. You have a space in this community that we're trying to build. And so I think like when you talk about restorative, right? That's really what we're working at. We're working at restoring those things that are taken from you before you even understand they're being taken. It's a lot bigger than just the one, like again, identifying the one person who caused harm and the one person who experienced harm. It's really about the conditions and community that we can create to have belonging. And I think you mentioned it, like when you can feel safety, then all things are possible, right? Because safety is the one thing that's been taken from you from the very beginning, right? I'm sure since your earliest memories are being unsafe, and then it just built out from there.
It's just like a feeling of the inability to be authentic,
Right, right.
because if you never feel safe. And
Yeah, you're
even,
performing.
yeah, but even like when I think of violence,
Right.
I don't, I didn't want to have to be violent. I didn't want to have to like fight with people and do, that's just like not really who I am. But, at a younger age, and like when that's what was going on around me, like I felt
Right.
like that's what I had to do.
Right.
So
Survival,
yeah,
right? In order to be safe, you had to survive. So this was fight or flight, the things you're identifying. Like if I feel like I have to fight for my life because my conditions aren't safe, then it's only normal in those conditions for you to fight for your life. Because it's not just about the act that the act that you're performing. It's about you're doing this thing because you're worried also about what the consequences of folks around you are going to do to you if you don't protect yourself.
so when you've been in these circles, uh how have you kept from sort of being triggered, or how, or have you been triggered a lot, and then how did you move through it, because you're still in the circle, so it must be doing something good for you.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
what are some
Um,
things that you might suggest, or when you think about like a global sort of, just sort of already going into these situations, knowing that there are people with high levels of trauma that are going to be triggered, and it's
right.
like, what are some things that you're doing, or that you think you could do in order to lessen that impact? in these spaces, or is it necessary to sort of work on it, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, I mean, everybody moves at their own pace, but I definitely think it's really important to move through those triggers. And that's one of the the points that we try to create. One of the conditions that we try to create in these circles is, first off, it's not like you just hop into the circle and we start talking about trauma, right?
Yeah.
It's really taking the time to build relationship with one another, and then gradually talking about things and opening up. Because once people feel safe and they feel seen and they know that no matter what, they're not going to be judged, then it's easier to begin to open up about things that you've either experienced or things that you have done. And there's no, like I said, there's no judgment, there's no requirement. It's really all consensual. So whatever you're willing to open up with, folks are there to support. And I think why that's important is you might only be able to talk about something to a certain extent, right? But it's about, how do we continue to show up in that space and support a person through that? And then you begin to realize, like, there's something triggering here. There's something here that's causing me to react or show up a different way. And so it's not just about like allowing a person to talk. It's about everybody using the collective wisdom that's in that room. Because like you were sharing, if you know that you're safe and you can talk about something with somebody, they may be able to share from their experience, skills they've obtained to help you skill up and learn how to move through something. And so you're able to identify some practices, whether that's, learning how to stay grounded, learning how to stay present, learning how to drop back into your body and get out of your head when you're experiencing a trigger, so that you can realize that this thing that happened to me isn't what's going on right now. And so I think there's just a set of practices that people learn, or a set of skills that people learn that they're able to practice in space and feel. And when you're able to practice it, it's like working an atrophied muscle, right? The more you do it, the stronger it gets. So when you experience traumas because you're hearing something or you're talking about something, and yet you have the skills and the tools to practice something different, it's like working that muscle. And now you're able to move through the trauma. And so it's like, it's how do you move through this in a way that's supported, that addresses your needs, and that is done in love, and it's at the pace that you want it to move. I think that is really what I've experienced. And that's, like you said, I'm still in circle, right? I'm still in circle, and I've been in at restorative, or not at collective justice, but in heal circles since 2017. And so it's just, for me, that's what works for me. And one of the things that I think it's really important to say is, like, RJ isn't the one all be all. It's not the panacea, right? What works for some people might not work for others. But for me, this is where I found the most effective ways of moving through my trauma, is being in space with other people who have shared similar experiences, and knowing that we all have enough collective wisdom and love to move through this together. And it doesn't mean we're going to be perfect. One of the things I tell people is, it is a practice. And for me, out of 7 days out of the week, I'm just looking to get 4 days of good practice. I'm not trying to be perfect, because perfection is not a real thing, right? But we, in our mind,
not perfection.
Exactly. So it's like, I'm just looking for 4 days out of the week. If I can get to 5, I'll be so grateful for life. You know what I mean? But I'm just shooting for 4. And I feel like if I can do that, I'm doing okay.
So I have so many things I want to say.
Yeah, for sure.
what would restorative, because I feel like the government honestly is one of the biggest perpetrators of harm.
Right.
So what is restorative justice between the government and the people look like?
That's a really good question.
And then just to add on that too, a lot of court systems and criminal justice systems, they say, it's too hard to implement restorative justice practices.
Right. And I would say this, I think it's too hard because in order for them to actually to fully fund it and source it, they have to give up power, right? They have to give up resources. And so I think that's the easy way out is to say, man, this is too much work. That's a pie in the sky. It's not reasonable, it's not rational. And I think the system that we have today wasn't built in a day, right? This is a system that was built over hundreds of years. And so the fact that because we want to imagine something different and try to move through trauma and harm in a different way doesn't mean that it's not possible. And at the same time, this is the system that wants to hold on to the status quo as it currently exists. And they want to tell people the only way you're going to get justice or the only way that you're going to get accountability is through relying on us to give you the outcomes that we think you need. Well, of course they're going to say that, right? Of course they're going to say that, because if they say, yeah, these are possible, then you don't need to rely on that system. You don't, that system gives up some of its power. It gives up some of its resource. And I mean, if you think about this realistically, all the money that goes into the court system, the criminal legal system, if you had that money going in the community, do you think over time that we would need these systems to be in place? Like I said, think about this. When you think about white neighborhoods in certain areas throughout any community, they're plenty safe. They have plenty agency. They're treated with dignity, and there's belonging in those spaces. And why is that? Because they're resourced and they're supported by the government. You go to communities of color, it's the exact opposite. They're oppressed by the government, right? Resources are denied them. Access to things are denied them. And if we all had those same resources, you wouldn't have the need. You would have plenty of safety. And so I think, again, it's cheap. It's an easy way to say like RJ doesn't work. And I think to answer your first question, like what does the RJ process look like between, communities and the government? One thing I just have to say is like, what is the government but the people who make it up? Right? What is these systems other than the people who make it up? And so
government workers, elected officials, or
right. And so as I think there has to be processes for looking at the impacts. It's not the intent that matters, it's the impacts of policies that they have on people, man. And there has to be real accountability for that. And one of the things that has been kind of asked before is like, who needs RJ more? Like is it more effective in communities of color? I think RJ is important in all communities, right? Because there's been a lot of harms that have happened on both sides, right? But most of that harm has come from a system that was designed to help white people, man. White supremacy. And to uphold white supremacy. And in order to get at that, like folks who cause that harm and uphold that harm, they need RJ work just maybe even more than people who have experienced the harm, right?
This kind of makes me feel bad because I'm an officer of the court.
Right.
I'm a licensed attorney, I'm an officer of the court, and I rose my hand and I said, I will uphold the laws and the Constitution of the state of Washington, when the reality is that there are harmful laws and rules in the state of Washington.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's like even myself, I have to look at that. I am an officer of I am a part of that system. Right. And if I take my oath seriously, then I would uphold the laws even if they're oppressive or not. And like, how do I feel about that?
Well, that's real. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's like we need folks like you in those spaces to address those, because that's the system that we're currently working in, right? And this is really important. For us is that like we can't deny the fact that we live in this reality, and it doesn't mean that we can't imagine for a different reality that we want for ourselves in the future. So the question is like, how do we get from where we are to where we would like to be? And we need folks like you in those spaces. We need other folks that are doing work in those spaces in order to make that happen. We can't live in isolation and expect for things to change. And so I think it's really important. So like, even when you identify laws that are harmful, it's like, okay, I don't agree with this law. What's the strategy? What's the community work that we need to do to address this? While also simultaneously working in community to help community heal up and skill up to organize around helping get those laws changed, right? And
Right.
so I think they don't have to be like dichotomous that they if you're working on this, you can't work on that. It's just I think that creates more problem and less progress.
So here's what I'd like to end with.
Okay.
And then, well, I'll ask one more question. Then anything that you would like to share, I would love to hear. But what are some, as far as, this big word accountability, I don't know how I feel about that word.
Right.
But what are some of the outcomes you've seen from restorative justice that have been super helpful? And you're like, wow, that is something that was never imagined in this criminal justice system. But when we think about healing communities and people, that these outcomes are like really powerful.
Right. So, man, you made a great point when it comes to accountability. I think a lot of people, when they hear that word, there's a negative connotation. And I think if you really think about what accountability has been defined to us, it's always about someone in power asking us to atone or say, I did this thing and I deserve to be punished. Right. And so the way that we look at accountability is it's really starts with self accountability, right? If I want to show up in the world, how do I want to do that? So identifying values that are in alignment with who I am. So those values could be, honesty, trust, love, dignity, seeing the humanity in each person that I engage with. And then now I want to operate according to those values, right? And when I step out of that and I cause a harm to somebody, the first thing I need to do is acknowledge that harm, right? And then also allow that person the space to figure it out what their needs are and what I'm obligated to do in order to make that right. And so it's not about punishment, it's about relationship, right? So accountability, self-accountability to me is how do I live right size? I'm not going to be perfect. I'm going to try to show up the best I can every day and be authentic and engage with folks. And if I do something that is harmful to them, I acknowledge it and I do what I need to do in order to make it right. I think when we're able to look at accountability like that and we're able to create these relationships that are values driven and allow us to work through conflict in a way that doesn't make a person feel dehumanized or make a person feel punished, then we're able to practice in ways that actually create healthy relationships, right? And so it's like having the space for you and I to have enough trust and to know that when you say, hey, Devon, you did this thing and it harmed me, and I acknowledge it and I don't try to like exaggerate the harm and make it about me, or I don't deny it, but I make it right sized. And I'm like, okay, yeah, let's talk about that and process it. Now we're able to see that when some stuff happens, we can work through it. And if you have certain needs based on what happened, I can be like, okay, I need to make that right. I'm going to do this thing to get there. So it's those small steps, it's those small things that create relationships that allow us to create communities. And so I think RJ really centers on accountability. And it's really about redefining what accountability means for all of us, and then living by practicing those values and trying to move forward through that. I hope that makes sense.
That makes sense. Back to just really want to clarify anything that you've seen within the RJ process that's been like, wow, like I would have never thought to do that, or I would have never,
I would just like, for me, what I would say is I've seen family members who have lost loved ones to gun violence, and to see them move to be in RJ spaces and to move through that harm and not just move through it, but to find strength and power through that process, and then to turn around and teach and educate folks and train folks and facilitate folks in these practices and these principles. I mean, it doesn't get any more powerful than that. So I've like literally, I've been in space with people as someone who has caused harm and taken a life, being in space with someone who has been on the other end of that and lost somebody to violence. And the way that they show up is humbling. It's humbling. And it shows me that anything is possible if a person is willing to go through the process.
I think about when I got back to when I got shot again. I would have wanted, if I would have died, I would have wanted my mom to forgive that person. I would have wanted my mom to even build a relationship with that person and hug that
Yeah.
person and not have to, and like find forgiveness in her heart and like live out her days and, more free. Because
Yeah.
if she didn't do that and just thought, probably even blamed herself for that and then
Yeah.
lived out her days in misery, what's
Yeah.
the alternative?
For sure. Yeah. For sure. And again, I like just real quick, I would say that a person might hear that and be like, oh, well, that's one person. I think a lot, and you're not alone. And the person I'm speaking about isn't alone. There's a lot of people that have experienced harm that would like to move through it. And there are people who are moving through it. Like she's not the only one in those spaces. There's a lot of folks who have experienced harm ranging from DV, sexual assault, to losing a loved one, to actually being like yourself, being shot, who have been able to find a process in RJ that works for them, that helps them move through it. And so, like I said, RJ isn't for everybody.
Yeah.
But what we found is that if people are willing to engage, you never know what you're going to find until you actually try it, right? And that's what's most important, is like, stop relying on the system that tells you this is the only way you're going to get the results you need, and start thinking of different ways and using your imagination on what it could mean to heal.
Well, a lot of times they're forcing us to take that.
Yeah.
We're forced to take that. And the people that have been harmed, people that harmed everybody, it's like, no, this is what will happen. You will be a part of the system and you will engage in the system. So
Right.
it's still not a choice.
It's not consensual. And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things about RJ is like RJ is all consensual. It's like we're not going to force anyone to participate. It doesn't matter what side of it you're on. It's really all consensual. And I think when people consent to participating, that's a lot different, right? I mean, it takes more to say, like, I'm making the decision to be a part of this, and regardless of what's going to happen, then the person who's like, I'm not going to do this, yeah, you're not going to get accountability that way. You're not going to get any type of change in behavior.
Well, Devon, I thank you for your time. And is there anything else that's on your heart to say before we go?
I would just, what's on my heart is I'm grateful to be in space. If there's something that I said that landed for folks, that's all the wisdom and from the folks I work with and the ancestors before me. If there's something I said that was, didn't land, that's me. And, I'll eat that. I'll take responsibility. I'm grateful for being here with you. I really admire the work you're doing. Keep pushing. And if there's anything I can do or CJ can do to help you, we're here.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for your time. I know you're a super busy guy and I really appreciate you.
No problem. I appreciate you too. Have a great day.